take a few questions. And Maurice, of course. And this question and answer period has been given a title, The Universal Vision Behind the American Dream. So that's quite a phrase.
Questions, comments, observations? Wonderful historical observations, yes? Great.
On the role, thank you. On the role of Freemasonry in the founding of our country, I know you mentioned it briefly, and I understand that a good third to half of the delegates to the Second Congress were Freemasons. But particularly in the light of Theosophy and the role of the adepts who I believe have said that Freemasonry in its time, in the 1770s, was an expression of the Theosophical movement. So could we explore that a little bit in terms of their influence? I know they were very much in favor of studying all religions secretly. Had to be secret back then. But did they have, in their own organization, for example, any democratic procedures or anything that carried over and guided them to help them to unify toward the Declaration first and then the Constitution?
Well, I'm certainly no expert on Masonry, so I think the general idea about Masonry was that once you entered a Masonic temple, you were able to drop your social role, your social status, and your rank. And people were more interested in your thoughts about principles of religion, abstract principles, and so they developed initiations, if you want to call them that, or gradations. So, and again, I get the impression it was to allow people to learn how to reason and not be dogmatic.
Yes, that is the essential point. And I believe the numbers around 30 of the signers of the Declaration of Independence were Masons. And you go to the Masonic Temple in Washington, D.C., and you can see who they are.
Yes, in Alexandria, Virginia, they have a 10-story Masonic temple, speaking about the elephant in the room.
As a quick anecdote, my grandfather was a lieutenant in the Haitian Navy, and he was a Freemason, and Catholicism wasn't compatible with that. And he received a warning. Remember, Freemasonry was often secret, right? You had to be very careful. And the story goes that a friend of his came to him and said that you're on the list of people that are going to be eliminated. So he had a problem. He had a wife and 5 daughters, and he had to figure out how to escape from Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic. So he came up with the idea that he would go to the office where they paid you and slip out of the harbor at night with his family to go to the Virgin Islands, which were nearby. And he had a brother there. So he went to the office, and first of all, the secretary at the front quizzed him pretty strongly about why he wanted to see the pay officer. And so he managed to soften it and get by her, and she went in and spoke with the pay officer, and he reluctantly agreed to have my grandfather come in. And so when he came in, my grandfather decided on the spur of the moment that he was going to shake his hand, but in the secret Freemasonry grip. And if he responded, he would know he was a Freemason. If not, then the man wouldn't know anyway. So when he took his hand and he did the Freemason grip, the man immediately looked at him and said, "Ah, brother, why are you here? And so he was frank. Now this man had to protect himself as well. So he said, all right, I understand your problem, and when you're on Trujillo's hit list, you're going to probably be eliminated. So he said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to rant and rave at you as though I am reluctantly giving you anything. So he cursed my grandfather up and down and this and that, and my grandfather stood there and took it. He wanted the lady at the front to hear what he said. So he arranged for him to get the money. He did slip out that night in harbor, escape to the Virgin Islands. And what is interesting is several years later, my mother was flying with my stepfather from the islands to Miami. They stopped in Santo Domingo. When they did, they got out of the airplane, it was a small plane, to walk toward the airport terminal. They saw someone walking toward them. A very elegant man came up to them, and he stood in front of them, and he said, "You're Mary Simmons, aren't you?" That was her maiden name. That was my grandfather's name. She said, "Yes." He said, "Fine. Stand here, talk with me. You, sir, take out a cigarette and start smoking. We're going to have a conversation, but don't you go into the airport." They have a long memory here. You were a Freemason. That didn't go well. We remember your grandfather, they do. So they had a conversation and they left. See, there are times when you belong to a fraternal organization where it's at a cost. Theosophists in various portions have had that problem as well. Anyway, I just thought you might appreciate the story about how these can really matter in terms of real-life incidents. Question?
We have an absolutely beautiful Masonic temple here in Philadelphia. So if you get a chance, go see it. It's amazing. It's right across from City Hall, and John Knievel will take you on a personal tour. So I have two questions. Thomas Paine has been referred to as an adept, and I'm wondering if HPV or Mr. Judge had anything to say about that. And my second question is the story about the mysterious stranger at the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Some people think it's fiction, and other people think it might have been Saint Germain. So your thoughts on that?
The first question, I couldn't hear who the name were you referring to? Paine, was it Paine?
Yes.
Oh. Yes, about, well, this student of Theosophy couldn't say that. We do know that Judge makes specific reference to the fact that he was highly influenced. And even though he mentions that Jefferson and Franklin and Washington were highly influenced as well, because, and for those of you who might not be Theosophists or familiar, it's not like manipulating someone when you're talking about influencing, anything like that. It's the notion that there's a harmonic between various states of mind of various people, and some people can have a very strong influence on other, just as we do in ordinary life. But even though that's true, what is interesting is that Judge specifically separates out Paine and refers to him as someone kind of out of a different order of development And you can tell it so much so by his evident, complete detachment about himself and his personal fortunes. Even Jefferson was limited to some degree by his image, and he didn't have the kind of, and Jefferson admitted that Paine is the one who could act. Paine was more than simply an excellent writer or more than someone who's very perceptive, but he was someone who could galvanize not only his own will, but others for a cause. And he is the one, I think Hermann printed it out in an article, wonderful talk given in the 20s on Paine, that Paine had the capacity to draw upon something deeper that allowed him to be completely fearless for the larger picture. And he, by the way, could have been a millionaire many times over. What did he do? On every occasion when he could have profited, he did not. He gave his funds when he got them, because he often didn't get the money that he even earned, but he donated them again and again and again to causes. If you're looking for litmus test, how do people deal when they have opportunities to benefit from the good that they do? That distinguishes a saint from a sage. See, because they don't get tempted by that. They're able to keep it at a distance and to use it for good. Everything they get, they have a way of turning it in a certain direction compatible with what they visualize and what they know to be something that is more beneficial to the whole. So in that sense, if you look at the criteria that we can say, what gives us a clue as to someone being someone of a greater degree of understanding? He could be a sleeping adept, he could be many things. But nonetheless, he was a very remarkable individual who was so open to the intuitive. He might not himself be able to formulate it that way, to the degree to which he was part of the 18th century, but we can see in looking at it from another perspective that he had a very operative mind that was at a higher level of operation. When you read his Age of Reason, and I read it before I became a student of Theosophy, and then you read it afterwards, it is amazing how, whoa, you didn't realize, you can turn the lens of the mind in a different way. And by the way, just to end this and give this over, if you want to read a superb book on pain that makes it a living thing, read a book called To Spit Against the Wind. It uses Franklin's phrase, Steve Levin, L-E-V-I-N, but it makes you feel like you're there, right? I mean, it's just a wonderful historical novel. I assure you, if you read it, it's hard to get a hold of, but if you read it, you'll feel like you were right living during the time of pain, and you understand the incredible trials. I'll tell you my litmus test, when Paine was in Paris during the French Revolution, and everything you can think of went wrong. And it was so depressing. He would lose friend after friend after friend. And people who were his enemies would come to him and say, "You got to help me, Thomas. I've got to get out of Paris." And he would help enemies get out and get to London. He stayed. See, this tells you something about the degree of commitment of really remarkable individuals.
Two short comments. Paine experienced injustice deeply from the British government, where his boss's embezzlement was blamed on him, and it hastened the death of his wife at the time. So, and he understood in a way that the Americans didn't, what the cruelty that was built into the British system. Also, it comes and goes as a story, but there are those who claim that Paine was the actual author of the Declaration of Independence, working closely through Jefferson. So maybe that's the mysterious stranger.
Let me just add a footnote to that for Elton's question. I read, there's a book out about Paine wrote the Declaration of Independence. I don't remember the name of the author. Yeah, oh, that's right. But I read the story where he came into, when people were talking about the Declaration of Independence, he came in and stood in the middle, said, "Rubbish. It was Paine that wrote the Declaration of Independence," and started giving all this evidence. So he had the passion that Paine actually wrote it. Well, who knows? You know, I read the argument a long time ago, but still, go ahead, Elton.
No, just a comment. I think it was Philip Forner's book on the life and writings of Tom Paine done in the 70s, if I remember. It kind of reawakened a lot of interest. But I believe he said in there that in the 2 years after Common Sense was published, next to the Bible, there were more copies of Common Sense in the 13 colonies than any other book.
That's true. Yeah, it's pretty phenomenal. People would have it read out to them who couldn't read. And one thing I read, and others might know more about it, but I believe at one point when there was a battle going on in one of the states, one of the colonies, about the war and later on about the Constitution, but someone brought in Paine's Common Sense and started reading it out loud. And the kind of quality of the sounding of something had the effect of quelling and calming and bringing a more rational element and a larger sense of purpose to where people could then settle down and quit their squabbles, kind of like Gandhi did a lot in the National Congress. He was able to get people eventually to simmer down, cool down, become a little more what we say noetic, and then was able to get people to bring their best self forward. That's a very remarkable quality. That itself is a very wonderful quality. Yeah. Other questions? Then you can be next. Yeah. Kim?
In the United States, when people speak of the American dream, it seems to be exactly equated to home ownership. I mean, seriously, I hear this at work. My coworkers, will say, "Well, I'm trying to achieve the American dream," and what it means is they're going to own a home. And
with a double garage, by the way.
Yes. So, just on a very practical, simple level for the simple thing to take home, what are some nice ways to respond to that expression, of that attitude in the common daily round when we hear people talk about the American dream in terms of home ownership or other material possessions? What are some really practical, nice things that are uplifting and helpful that could be said?
Well, I usually hear the word opportunity, and sometimes it's opportunity to buy a home, but I think one could respond with the idea that it's the breath of freedom that provides the opportunity even for home ownership, but that the pursuit of happiness, of course, can go beyond just material things, that the reason people are happy, we do have a spirit of freedom. Up until recently, our universities were the ones all the world desired to go to because of a spirit of freedom. That the American dream, of course, means more than just home ownership, but for some people, that's getting your first house and if you've never gotten it before, that's something to be proud of.
I would give the same answer of emphasizing freedom, because I think that's what we do have in this country. You can move where you want, you can go for whatever career you want, you can go fishing if you want, and also you can join clubs, make organizations. And we don't use the word as much as we should, but outsiders, immigrants, usually put that at the top of the list. What is it they like about life in America? And they usually do say freedom. So I would say, well, yes, that's valuable, owning a home, but isn't it most valuable to have the freedom to choose what you want to do? And link that with what is now called self-definition. There are those who say, who is an American? It's someone who wants to engage in self-definition, transformation, attach themselves to what they choose to do. So the call to freedom is, and broaden it, and make it, have people recognize. Incidentally, I just did want to mention that while we're right now all depressed and in turmoil because of the quality of our current president, the fact remains that there's government doing lots of good things. Does anyone know how many governments there are in the United States? Want to take a guess? You got the 50 states. 51. It's estimated about 85,000. If you count all the counties and the special districts, school boards, sanitation districts, it's a phenomenal number, and they're all working, and they all exercise authority to make certain decisions, and in many cases to tax. So that's a fantastic accomplishment. We're governing ourselves regardless. If Congress and the president never does anything for the next 3 years, that might be okay.
In response to the question, Ed Dotson, who's visiting tonight, who's president of Thomas Paine Friends and also is an expert on Henry George, the expert on the commons use of land, wanted to say a few words.
Carolyn's remark, I'd like to ask you to reconsider a little bit. The term freedom has a connotation very different from the term liberty. One of the most, Thomas Paine was a major influence on my life as a young person. Henry George was another who came along. A third philosopher who I would recommend you might think about reading if you have never done so is Mortimer J. Adler. If you don't know who Adler was, he was editor of the Encyclopedia Britannica, the founder of the Great Books discussion program at the University of Chicago. And Adler, in a book called The Common Sense of Politics, distinguishes freedom from liberty by saying, liberty is freedom constrained by justice. We ask for liberty, we ask for freedom when we really should be asking for liberty and not freedom, because freedom can exceed the bounds of liberty and take us into what John Locke talked about, the realm of license, which is involved privilege. And so that's really what I wanted to say about that. The other thing that I would say about Paine, the one writing that later in my reading of Paine that really has influenced me is his remarkable essay titled Agrarian Justice, which is the most progressive statement of public policy that one could imagine, particularly for someone writing at the end of the 18th century. It's a remarkable document, and it is a statement of real liberty and equality of opportunity.
Is it on the internal website?
On the IRS?
On the Social Security site. The U.S. Social Security website has agrarian justice.
Thank you for indulging me.
Thank you. I think this gentleman had. No, okay. No, go ahead. Oh, yeah. Okay, sorry.
I'm not American, but you talk a lot about freedom, and is there something about responsibility for the whole, solidarity and something like that? Can you say something about that, please?
Does Paine say something about this?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Well, yes, certainly he does. He was not the kind of immature American who wants freedom without the limits of justice? No, pain would not be like that at all. It was, in fact, in our study circle this afternoon, one of the things that became apparent is, if I can now shift this for a moment to theosophical thought, when HBB sets out, explains, elaborates, elucidates the fundamental concepts and principles, and we, under our own karma, have the fortune and privilege to encounter that and begin to study it. One of the interesting things is that that immediately creates a responsibility. The privilege of encountering universal, soul-satisfying, uplifting ideas and ideals is that it immediately puts you in a position of responsibility. And one of the things we were discussing, when you think of the atomization that's occurring in the world in so many senses, and people are looking for some form of community, and it ends up being tribalism, ideology, and so forth and so on, what you have is the shadow of community. What you have is the shadow of globalization. And so, because there's no expansion of the circle, they become very narrow in their sense of community and also sense of responsibility, because they don't have a sense of responsibility beyond the boundaries. Well, the interesting thing is once you start thinking like that, and this is very compatible with pain, by the way, is then what is your responsibility? To look for tribalism in your own psyche. Are you subject to being swayed by liberalism if you're a liberal? Or conservatism by you're a conservative? Or do you react? So all these elements HBB is pointing out, you begin here, as people have pointed out so beautifully today, actually in many different contexts. But yes, pain was very much irresponsible. In fact, in the article that Herman pointed out to me, one of the interesting things was, you know, Franklin said, where there's liberty and equality, I wish to be there. And Paine said, where there's no liberty and no equality is where I want to be. That's an interesting thing. One last question? Yeah, Richard.
This question's for Jim. So, was Paine aware of his enlightenment in any way, or was there a teacher involved? Is it known to us in any way? Did he know his position, his path? I mean, to what extent was he aware of this? You know, that he was so unique and yet unaware of it.
That's, I'll give you the Indian of the head. It's very hard to say based on observations and his own writings. He certainly had a strong sense of himself, but not the egotistical way we can use that. That's what I find very interesting in him. I've read criticisms of Paine by people who usually were his enemies, but not excluding his friends either, who said, you know, he had these remarkable abilities, he could quote things, you know, he had like a photographic memory. He had wonderful capacity to entertain people when they came. He could remember story after story, idiosyncrasy. He was so perceptive. It's like his mind was always fertile, perceptive, grasping, seeing, you know, nuances and so forth and so on. But at the same time, as I intimated earlier, what seems to be a wonderful quality that we would call a kind of bodhisattva quality was the fact that he had genuine inward reverence, because he so fervently believed in the magnificence and he said magnificence of the divine and its absolute fathomless splendor, and the fact that every human being also comes from that same source and has the divine gift of reason, which is really in Paine very subtle and very remarkable. Given that, I mean, why can't you both be confident and humble? And as Professor Iyer once pointed out, The interesting thing about people who are too strong in their confidence and get a little cocky, life will adjust them in time. But people who are insecure, it's really difficult. If you're dwelling in insecurity all the time, it's difficult to gain confidence. And so one of the great things that people do who have a lot of it is they learn how to encourage others and give them confidence. I think Payne did that with a lot of people.
Thank you, all three, so much. Well, it's getting late. We won't even do any housekeeping. We'll see you tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. And we'll have another day of learning about Brotherhood, Nucleus, and healing. Thank you. Okay.